You're very welcome to the Firm and Fast Golf podcast. I'm your host, Shane Derby. Robin Bargmann joins us for the final time today as we conclude our investigations into the origin stories of some of the first golf courses in the Netherlands. The last two episodes provided listeners with an introduction to the historical context that preceded the introduction of the game of golf in Holland. Conversations with Robin Bargmann have primarily been based on his Serendipity of Early Golf book, which was published in 2010. It is now out of print. However, I have included a link in the show notes where you may indeed be able to pick up a used copy should you wish to delve into the story in any further detail. It was interesting to note the shared mercantile, educational and familial interrelationships that have existed through time between the Netherlands, Scotland and England. These links have undoubtedly influenced the direction of travel of a diverse range of areas such as migration, colonisation and indeed the development of sporting pursuits, to name but a few. Today's conversation is very much focused on modern Dutch golf. Over the course of the next hour or so, we will take a look at some of the important early pioneers that founded the first golf clubs in the Netherlands. While it is true that the original courses in The Hague, Hilversum, Arnhem, Utrecht, Zandvoort and Noordwijk no longer exist, these early pillars of the game of golf in the Netherlands still endure over 100 years later. Dutch golf is very fortunate that these early clubs and their custodians had the foresight to engage the masterful Harry Colt and his design partners Charles Hugh Alison and John Morrison in designing 10 golf courses throughout the Netherlands from 1927 onwards. I would once again like to extend my gratitude to Robin for the amount of time he extended to me in putting together the last number of episodes, and indeed to all the listeners out there for listening. We do hope you enjoy the conclusion of our conversation. Perhaps I can ask you, Robin, about the early pioneers of early modern golf in the Netherlands. I know you mentioned to me Albrecht del Court van Krimpen was kind of key to the whole thing.
Yeah. Well, my co-writer of the latest book, he is kind of made a biography of him in the book. Published it. The interesting thing that he wasn't really an aristocrat. He was from a Flemish family in the past, and tried to point out that one of the guys in the famous Rembrandt painting of, say, a cloth trader, was portrayed in the Rembrandt painting and was an important man. Delcourt is obviously, if you see the word, Delcourt is kind of French, de la Cour, of the court, basically it means, and in Dutch it would have been van het Hof. The word Hof and Cour is the same, and you see the name van het Hof, you see. But there's a lot of actually French family names in the Netherlands and in Scotland for that matter. So like Bruce, Robert de Bruce, and Wallace, they're all French Dutch names. Dus van Brussel, Brussels, Brussel, that's Bruce. Now you can't spell it with a CE, but it's the old spelling is BRUS, and Wallace is Valais. Valais is the southern part of Flanders. So you see a lot of that. It's sometimes very hard to trace back family histories. I'm saying this because Delcourt van Krimpen, he basically applied for recognition of his aristocratic roots. He wanted to belong to the upper crust of aristocracy in the Netherlands. But that was turned down, so it was a bit of a disappointment. But he was definitely in that circle, and he was his father actually purchased a house near Haarlem, and that's basically where he grew up. And he later moved to and purchased an estate near Arnhem. But his mainstay was actually around Haarlem, and he married into an important family in Haarlem with roots and connections in the cotton industry. William I, as king, wanted to develop cotton industry in and around Haarlem. For after the independence of the North had to develop. All industry was in the southern Netherlands. So you see a huge development in the 19th century of industry in the northern Netherlands. Northern Netherlands was actually, merchant shipping, fishery, and agriculture. But heavy industry was all in the south. So that you see a new development of that in and around Haarlem. And so many of those families living in Haarlem and Kennemerland were actually involved in the new industry, and usually coming from the south, actually, their families. But anyway, that's his background, and having also married into this other family. He I'm not sure, because I haven't it would be good actually for you. You've seen the name Arnoud Janmaat, my co-writer.
Yeah, I have, yeah.
Because it depends what you want to know. There's a lot to know about him, but he became interested in agriculture because of land ownership in Krimpen. That's why he's got the name Krimpen added to his name, which is actually around Rotterdam here. But that was kind of a hobby of his, and he, through family relationships in England, he became interested in golf and golf architecture. Golf architecture is something that moved from, well, as you know, as the people working as groundsmen, caddies, club makers, but basically artisans on the golf courses. It moved to people interested in understanding, and people interested and people who understood agriculture, and especially everything about grass. And then from there on, you can make a layout. But before making a layout, you have to know if you're making a bunker there, and so you want some sand. You have to understand what type of grass you have to have around the bunker, so that it does grow and doesn't grow too high, and what type of grass you're using. I'm a member of Royal Dornoch, and in 2016 they celebrated 400 years of golf in Dornoch. That's typical Scots. It's almost commercial. And I'm glad they didn't make T-shirts and things like that. But anyway, there is a document indeed of Gordon Sutherland or Moore, whatever, describing the links of Dornoch being the best links in the country, and even surpass those of Montrose and St Andrews, and are excellent for playing golf on, amongst other things. It was also good for the hunting and for horse riding. But anyway, describing the links of Dornoch, and so you could see actually in that document of 1616 that there's a reference to golf being played in Dornoch. So that's why they said 400 years of golf in Dornoch, which is actually true. And by the way, it shows two things, that golf was played on the links by royalty. Yeah, because this Robert Gordon, he was the Duke of Sutherland, of the Earl of Sutherland, same time. And he basically, the Duke of Sutherland, he was later promoted to the, because of the clearings, the King of England made him a duke, and he was not a very popular duke in Scotland because he was basically supporting the English with the clearings in Scotland. So in Dornoch, if you say the Duke of Sutherland, that guy, the first Duke of Sutherland, they still hate him. But anyway, this for Royal Dornoch, actually a friend of my father's was a Scottish golfer here. He was a member of the RAF and an RAF bomber as a youngster, 18 years old. And because he was so young, he was not put in the forefront. So luckily he survived. And he became a KLM pilot after the war. You see a lot of RAF pilots actually coming to Lufthansa, KLM, SAS. It was a build-up of civilian industry or airways movement. And so he lived in Holland, and he was a very good golfer. And I played many times against him in club championships. He was a scratch golfer. I never made it below 2. I had other things to do also. But he phoned me one day. He said, "Look, I'm 94, and they've diagnosed something in my leg. They have to cut it off, and I'm not going to do that. So I'm stepping out, and I've got a lot of stuff of my grandfather's. And maybe you want it." He says, "The family here is not interested. And before I throw it away, why don't you have a look at it?" And he basically gave me this. I have to be a bit careful. And it's basically an album of newspaper cuttings. So you see here, a contribution by J. Sutherland in the London Daily News or something. He's trying to, that's basically an index that he didn't use, which wasn't helpful that he didn't use it, but I can. And so what he did is he cut out his column in the Daily News, and he had a bi-weekly, so once every 2 weeks he had a column. And I'm saying that because the grandfather of this friend of mine, Bunny Henderson, was John Sutherland. So he gave this material, and this is what he wanted to throw away. And he says, my grandfather, well, yeah, he was some kind of secretary of a golf club somewhere in Scotland. I didn't like him, he said. For grandchildren, he was a bit, was not a nice guy. So that's the information he gave me. So I looked at it, and I phoned him back immediately. I said, I've done a bit of research. And I said, well, your grandfather was the secretary of Royal Dornoch, and he was secretary for 53 years until 1941, when he died, or 43, something like that. And he basically made Royal Dornoch into what it is today. And he started off as a youngster, as secretary of the club at 18 years old, and working together with Tom Morris Senior, who had come over and made a design for a new 18 holes, but
And he would, of course, known Donald Ross, and
he educated Donald Ross. Donald Ross was his pupil. He molded Donald Ross into, and Donald Ross always, and Donald Ross actually didn't like. He was an unfriendly, tough bastard. I know exactly how he would have been. Everybody who wanted to change anything in his club and did not have his permission, he was in for big trouble with John Sutherland. You don't touch anything without my permission, especially in his older days. In his younger days, he was a great golfer. I think he reached the semifinals in the amateur championship. But what I wanted to say is, as a youngster, he made sure that he knew everything about the knowledge of greenkeeping, how to build a course, and everything about grass, and that's what you see with the early professionals. Like in the Netherlands, we have Henry Burroughs, and he was basically a grass specialist. He could play golf at the same time, but it wasn't the other way around. And with Sutherland also, that's why he was asked. And I consider John Sutherland to be actually one of the important golf architects of northern Scotland of his time, but because he was secretary of the club and he didn't want to be seen as a golf professional, and in those days it was very important, if you made money in any way out of golf, you're a professional. Even if you carry a bag at 17 years old and you get money for it, you're a professional. That's why actually the age of 16 years old for caddies was quite important, actually.
we see that in later years with Francis Wemay and that whole
yeah. Well, the interesting thing is Delcourt had written a book, or actually written a chapter in a book, the sports in the Netherlands or something like that, and he's got the chapter golf.
Uh-huh.
And he refers to the professional Bobby Jones.
Uh-huh.
And this is in 1910 or so.
Uh-huh.
Or whatever, yeah, somewhere there. Actually, in the early time, but interesting to see that Bobby Jones had been fighting all his life to make sure that he would not be recognized as a professional, and he actually received a letter in 1957, pretty late, from the USGA, confirming that he was an amateur for the whole of his life.
Uh-huh.
He was afraid that they would take away, and retrospectively.
Uh-huh.
Take away his Grand Slam.
Okay.
But anyway, but that's John Sutherland was, for that reason, actually careful not to be considered a golf architect and being paid for it.
Uh-huh.
But he developed a lot of those courses in the north, and basically being invited by the clubs as being a secretary. And the problem is his name is Sutherland, so you see sometimes in the records, Mr. Sutherland, and who's Mr. They don't realize that it's this Mr. Sutherland. Uh-huh. So if you like Brora, the 18 holes of Brora is all the work of Sutherland.
Wow. And
later James Braid, he came there for a day, and this was 20 years later, and because of new balls and whatever,
yeah.
The layout had to be changed slightly, but it was only changed slightly, and now Brora is known as a James Braid course, and it's all Sutherland. And you have a number of courses out there, like the Castle Dunrobin is, I forget the name of the club there, but that's also his work. And he was basically very close friends with the Duchess of Sutherland, actually. But he was called Sutherland and not Mr. Sutherland, and so there was he was an ordinary man.
Yeah.
he didn't belong, and so he was really a good servant to the Duke of Sutherland, and the Duchess, she loved him, but actually as a servant, and he understood that. So, but he was basically employed by the city of Dornoch, and he was paid by the city of Dornoch, and he was responsible for the real estate development of Dornoch. That's where he made a bit of money also, of course. But he was never paid as golf secretary and never paid for his work as golf architect. That's why you don't find him. And there are quite a few actually. Like if you look at, and in England, some of them are recognized, like Fowler for Walton Heath, where Truett made his book. You can say if he is recognized as a golf architect, and you can find that he was being paid for it, he's not an amateur. And the rules were in those days, it had to, you went back to basically your birth or your 16th. You're once a professional, always a professional, which is those rules obviously don't apply anymore. But if you read those causerie articles of Sutherland, it's surprising how much he knows about what I call the turf, and therefore the layout. He basically combines two things. You have to be a good golfer, understand the swing, and hit a ball perfectly, so that you can actually appreciate the golf layout. And a golf layout can only be done perfectly if you understand how you lay out a golf course and the upkeep of the ground and understand the grass. So those two things go hand in hand, and nowadays that's almost gone. I mean, we basically say if I know enough about Harry Colt and his work, that I understand everything about golf course architecture. It's interesting reading his essays of Harry Colt. You've got them probably, or not? You can get them in reprint if you have one of the original, the first publication of his essays. I think you pay £4,000 for it nowadays. Yeah. No. Grant has a nice reprint.
Yeah, I have the reprint.
Yeah,
not the original. It's funny. There's a commonality across obviously Colt's stuff and Mackenzie's stuff, and I guess various other golden age architects that do have that knowledge base that you speak about in terms of grass, but obviously playing as well. But maybe perhaps talking about Colt, I can drag you back across the North Sea and maybe speak about your beloved the Kennemer Golf and Country Club.
Yeah.
Maybe as a case study.
Yeah. Well, yeah. It must be hard talking to me because I'm stuck in the past and.
No.
No, but I love the Kennemer.
No, not at all. You love the Kennemer, so and I know that, and we're still talking about the past, but maybe the more recent past. I mean, looking at the foundation of the Kennemer as perhaps a case study of how a club was set up back in the early days of modern golf in the Netherlands. Certainly, in an Irish context, you're talking about the landowner, the local banker, the merchant, the expats. We've already established that, in all likelihood, it's a game, at least initially, for the moneyed, the wealthy, the merchants. That probably these courses are built in locations that are near to their summer residences or their second houses, perhaps. Would that be a fair reflection?
Golf started actually in the back garden of the wealthy aristocrats. And these people lived actually in nice areas, like around The Hague. In Amsterdam has nothing actually, so that would be Kennemerland. and on the other side, Holland, which is Hilversum. And then you'd have the area around Utrecht and the area around Arnhem. Those were the traditional areas where aristocrats lived. And the difference, you didn't have a lot of aristocrats actually in around Haarlem, because the merchants of Amsterdam would live there. Merchants are not aristocrats. They make money, and aristocrats spend it. And in The Hague, you had a lot of aristocrats with connections with the Dutch East Indies. And that was a bit of different type of people, colonials. And the landed gentry around Utrecht and Arnhem, those were the traditional aristocrats, Dutch aristocrats, old aristocratic families. But you would see that the pioneers would be more in Haarlem and The Hague, just because of the type of people. The traditional landed gentry, maybe they had ties with the English, but, they would be followers and not pioneers. So the pioneers are actually in The Hague, the family van Briene, Boreel, and around Haarlem, what's his name, our friend Delcourt van Kempen. Well, you wouldn't lay out 9 holes in your back garden, huh? So usually they would lay out 4 or 5 holes. And, long holes, but not that long, but long enough not to be short. So depending on the size of the estate, and I haven't found out where the contact is, but I'm pretty sure it was the English family of van Briene and the English family of Boreel, and Daisy van Briene, which was actually the pioneer of golf and a female, by the way. So she was the daughter of Baron van Briene, who owned the estate of Klingendael, where The Hague started. But she was and actually from her life, she was, a feminist and lesbian, but in those days you didn't talk about it. But I'm pretty sure that she was in that corner and had good friends in British English aristocracy around London. Also in that, sometimes they had to stay for half a year in The Hague with Van Briene to make sure that her lesbian activities of this English girl, and we're talking about Alice Keppel. Alice Keppel was the friend of Edward VII, King Edward VII, and before that Bertie, the Prince of Wales. Alice Keppel was his favorite. How would you say in English? We say maîtresse, and
mistress.
Mistress, yeah, sorry. And of course, Alice was married to an important officer in the British Army, and her daughter of Alice Keppel was also a good friend of Daisy van Briene. The name Daisy is the name of a flower, and the name of the flower, by the way, is Margriet in Dutch, or Marguerite. Dus her actual name is Margriet, but was given by her English friends the name Daisy. That's why she's called Daisy van Briene. But anyway, so the Daisy van Briene was of the family because her father was more into horses, was not interested really in golf, but she wanted to play golf and tennis, the early form of lawn tennis. And so on the estate of Van Briene, and I'm pretty sure actually these are contacts that Bobby Boreel had with Thomas Dunn, but I haven't been able to find it because he sent his son, John Duncan Dunn, over to the Netherlands to basically lay out the first golf courses in these private estates. But he was, if you calculate it backwards, he was 17 years old. And he was 18 years old because he's responsible for the layout and of and also the building. But together with the local groundsmen. And there were enough local groundsmen, of course, in these aristocratic families because their estates were so large, so they had a lot of basically groundsmen working for them. John Duncan Dunn was responsible for the layout and design of the oldest 4 golf courses. So The Hague, and then after that Doornse in Utrecht, and after that Roosendaalse, and in the same year Hilversum. I actually helped Hilversum understanding that they were not founded in 1910, but in 1895. And they only changed that 5 years ago. And I said, you have to understand that you're part of the old 4 golf courses. So it's a very important part of the heritage of golf in the Netherlands that you have to understand that those 4 golf courses, the first official 9-hole golf courses, were all laid out by John Duncan Dunn, the son of Thomas Dunn, and the Thomas Dunn dynasty. Most of them actually, and John Duncan also, he followed, I think, his brother to America, and they actually had a big golfing careers in America, which was a huge territory for them to pioneer in and develop their business. There was far more competition, of course, in England. And so if you were flexible enough, you went to America. And John Duncan Dunn was, of course, a youngster. And you're talking about the period of the end. And no, maybe I'm wrong there. I was basically saying the end of the Belle Époque period, and things changed. The period 1900 to 1910 is basically the turnaround of the Belle Époque, where you start seeing the decadence, and everything pointed towards all these lemmings jumping over the rock, and which ended up in the First World War, which they happily let go, especially the British aristocrats as the leading force there, which was they never realized how dreadful it was. It was all the honor. So they had actually never understood modern warfare and what it meant. But it had to be, and it changed society completely. And so after the war, and in the Netherlands was neutral, and neutral is another way of doing nothing and actually being pro-German. And the Dutch Kaiser was, when he was kicked out there, he lived in Holland, and his son also. And they were fools. But we shouldn't have allowed them in, actually. But anyway, it doesn't matter. So they lived actually where the golf course in Utrecht was, at the Doornse. That's where the German Kaiser lived. Uh-huh. The Kennemer was founded in 1910, and that it's totally different to those old 4 ones, because these were really merchants from Amsterdam living in Kennemerland, who had made their money actually in industry and trade in Amsterdam and internationally. Who said, okay, and you had the richest man in the Netherlands who owned the estate down at Kruidberg, but he was the most important colonial tobacco grower, merchant, and from that, actually the most influential man in the Netherlands. He came back to the Netherlands to become Minister of Colonies, just to make sure that his business was protected and that you could keep the modern slave industry going. He introduced the coolie law, and this was actually making slaves out of the Indian Hindus that you brought into Sumatra in 1874. This was 10 years after abolition of slavery. And basically the growers, the plantation owners, and the Dutch plantation owners, they all had these coolies. So they became hugely wealthy from the tobacco, rubber, soy was later, and the tin and oil industry. But the laborers were all these coolies, and the law said you basically owned these guys, so you had to house them, and you gave them food and schooling or medical care, but they were not allowed to run away. As a coolie owner, you were allowed to punish them. So it's basically slavery. There's a study going on here. You know, I understand it all in the time, but you don't have to hide it. So just talk about it. And the Dutch king is going to publish actually the role of the royal family in slavery. That's going to come next year. But they're basically focusing on West Africa and America. But and I'm not sure they're going to talk about Indonesia at all. That's the source of ritual, because actually the golden age where we made all our money on the Dutch East Indies, we were bankrupt by the end of the 18th century. So the wealth actually started in the mid 19th century, and actually the whole of the period up until the Second World War. And so, but that's okay. But there's coming back to golf in the Netherlands, actually. So you see the beginning of golf, those 4 golf clubs, that was really the old aristocrats having interrelationships with the English, let's say British, and because of their ties in the Dutch East Indies in the 19th century. The Kennemer is in that sense different. The class below that, say the wealthy merchants, said, "Hey, we also want to play golf." And on the estate of Kramer, this guy who made all this money on the tobacco business in Sumatra and East Indies, and who I explained was the Minister of Colonies and considered the wealthiest man in the Netherlands. So Kennemer started on his estate. His estate was basically the dunes, but developing and he didn't want to give the dunes to us. He could have easily. It's 15 kilometers by 5 kilometers. So it's a large area. You can build 100 golf courses on that without seeing each other. But the Kennemer started with a 9-hole course, which Delcourt actually laid out on grassland. And two of the 9 holes were actually just partly on the other side of the road on sand. But the other 7 holes were below the road, so below water level, on grassland where normally cows would. So that wasn't that interesting. But the dunes next to the grassland of the Kennemer are, it's pretty hilly, and you make your golf courses basically in the valley between the dunes.
Not quite as hilly as Royal Hague, but yeah, I get what you're getting at.
Yeah, the Royal Hague could never have been built in 1910. That you need, but the type of people of the Kennemers were very different. And the daughter of Kramer was married to the secretary of the Dorens.
Uh-huh.
And she had been national champion of the Netherlands women's golf. And in, I think somewhere in 1908 or so. But anyway, in 1912 or 1910, but basically just after the founding of the Kennemer, that should be 1910, 1911. So we didn't have a golf federation yet, or Nederlands Golf Committee. And the guy who handled all championships or coordinating matters between the golf clubs, because you only had 4 golf clubs, was Delcourt van Kempen. And he organized the Ladies' Championship of 1912. And there were only 6 participants, maybe less. One of which was Dora Kramer, so the daughter of the big man of down in Kaartberg. And Delcourt decided with less than 6 or less than 8 participants, we're not having a championship, you see. And Kramer was furious about that because he was a very, he wanted his daughter to be the best, you see. He was a very ambitious man. I was looking for the word. In business, he wanted always the best and the most. And so, that very powerful man. So he hated Delcourt van Kempen for actually cancelling that championship because it was depriving his daughter of a national championship. Although he himself was not a golfer, he didn't care less about golf, but he did care about his daughter. And so his son-in-law, who was the secretary of the Dorrance, was basically commanded by him, you will found a golf federation and kick out Delcourt van Kempen and make sure that he doesn't interfere anymore. And this was just after the Kennemer had been founded. So in 1910, you basically have the 4 clubs and the Kennemer. And the Kennemer being, this fairly ambitious club with the ambitious down in Kaartberg connection, with the Kramer family also being in the board. And Mr. Kramer himself, the old man, immediately being appointed the honorary chairman of the club. So those are, and he was, by the way, he was the closest friend of Queen Wilhelmina, because what he had established as Minister of Colonial Affairs, if a concession was given for the development of, a new mine or a new plantation, a new company, also railroad and shipping around the island. If a concession was given, 10%, I'm saying 10%, but it's roughly 10%, of shareholding was given to the royal family as part of the concession. And that's the reason for the huge wealth of the royal family. So I'm very eager to know if they're going to come out with that type of information. And that was actually quite clever, because this way Kramer stayed in charge. So he's basically saying, give me that concession and you'll get 10%. Nowadays, you go to prison for it. And so when Delcourt cancelled the national championship for women, Kramer basically told his son-in-law, you will establish a new golf federation. And the 5 clubs existing then, including the Kennemer, were all invited, and only 4 participated in the founding of the golf committee, as it's called. And you see, it doesn't have a legal status, so it's just a committee of people. And because of the founding of the National Olympic Committee, you could only be a member of the National Olympic Committee, and this was just before the war. You had to be you had to have a legal status to be a member of the Nederlands Olympisch Comité. So if you wanted to be a member as a federation of the NOC, you had to have legal status.
Uh-huh.
So that's why the federation was set up, and the members were all the golf clubs. So, but in a way, it's the same. But it expanded from there on.
So after the First World War, obviously, you had mentioned the original Kennemer site at Sandport, I believe. Okay, so 7 of the holes are kind of below the water table, essentially grassland. So somebody obviously decided, okay, this is less than optimal. And I believe they started looking for a new site, which is obviously where you are now. So what can you tell me about that?
The Kennemerland consists of northern Kennemerland and southern Kennemerland. So Sandpoort, where the Kennemer started off is near Velze, and that's the northern Kennemerland. So in Haarlem is kind of the border, although Haarlem is not in on the coast. But basically, if you draw a line, everything south of the center of Haarlem is southern Kennemerland. And Zandvoort is part of South Kennemerland. Indeed, say in the interbellum period, especially in the period of the 30s, plans had been made, and in 1928, you had the big crash, economic crash, Wall Street crash, and the effects of that started coming out in 29, but were really felt in the period 33, 35. So nobody stopped these plans and said, hey, wait a minute, an economic crisis is going to come over us and whatever. And from that on, I mean, National Socialism and the war, I mean, nobody expected that it was going to go that direction, although a few did. So they, Van der Vliet is actually part of a very rich family, and that's called the Borsky family. Borsky are probably Polish Jewish family originally. Made a lot of money actually in trade and merchant banking, and were even responsible for saving the Dutch central bank, which was a private bank in those days, the Nederlandse Bank, the Netherlands Bank, by putting in 5 million guilders in 1855. 5 million guilders is a lot of money actually in those days. But the Borsky family, and actually the Borsky family owned quite a lot of the estates, or built the estates in southern Kennemerland. So everybody thought, and Van der Vliet himself lived there, so you would think that it would be quite easy for him to realize a golf course there. I mean, even if you have a race course built in Zandvoort, the Formula One, that's basically South Kennemerland, our neighbors. That was easily built there, so on a estate of the Van der Vliet and the Borskys. But you know, the families kind of didn't agree, and other families also. But the Quarles family, who traditionally owned a large portion of the dunes, had to sell actually most of it to the Amsterdam water, because the water sources for Amsterdam be determined to be the Kennemer dunes. So all the water developed, drinking water for Amsterdam came from the dunes of Kennemerland. So there was a direct pipeline to Amsterdam. And a little bit of land was kept by the family Quarles to do a bit of hunting. So 90 hectares or so. So it's basically the 3 9-hole loops that are the Kennemer. He was a member in Zandvoort, and he loved golf, and he said, you know, we've got this land, so why don't we actually offer the club that they can move the club to Zandvoort? And that's basically family Quarles who did it. And the second generation, Peter Quarles, who I know quite well, and I was allowed to say Uncle Peter, because his father was Piet and he was Peter. So Quarles van Uffert, and that basically, he's long gone, but
you are still using his land in Zandvoort, though, which is good news.
Yeah. No, well, we bought it. It was just after I joined the committee as a treasurer.
And that was, of course, Harry Colt's first course in the Netherlands, yeah?
Yeah. And I haven't found, I know that D. McCall was secretary, and he, you know, was kind of a John Sutherland secretary, so he understood how you had to do greenkeeping and how would you call it? Actually, I was going to say course management, but that's different. But how to understand to
agronomy?
Yeah, exactly. You have to understand the agricultural side of and D. McCall was actually pretty good, and I'm not sure where the contacts came from, but he was obviously, he had been introduced. Maybe it was also commercial contacts, Colt himself, but I haven't found the first link between the Kennemer and it must have been D. McCall, or at least he took over the contacts between Kennemer and Colt. But they were all handled by D. McCall, the secretary, and he was basically the right-hand man for Colt in getting things done. And D. McCall basically executed what had to be done.
Copain, of course, would be used as the...
Yeah, and that was quite interesting. Colt wanted to bring in his own...
Frank Saris, probably,
from England. And actually, Copain had already been involved in actually developing golf courses, you see, for families or whatever, private grounds. And I found one of a family of a good friend of mine that he at Copain. I found the drawings of a 4-holes course that he made in the garden of the family of a good friend of mine, and that was done actually before the Kennemer. And this is a garden or an estate near the Kennemer. And the reason for that is that Mr. Copain was married to an English girl, so the son of the big Copain, but the Copain who basically handled all the contracts with the course building with the clubs. He had basically been educated in England and had married an English girl there and had worked actually for the company of her father's, and he was in landscaping. For the large estates, he did landscaping business. So that's how Copain was educated. So Colt met with him and realized this guy was actually perfect and much better than bringing over a constructor from England. And the way Colt works, he would send a bill to the club for whatever, £3,000. Everybody thought that's very cheap, actually, yeah? Building, having a course designed by Mr. Colt, but his main contract was with Copain. He would basically get 50% of the bill there, and that's something that we didn't see, but we didn't know, of course. But that was the earning model. You send basically what you do is you charge the club for advice and the design, and if they say, okay, it's a good idea, you send a bill for whatever, that £2,000-3,000, and then you sign a contract with Copain, and he signs, Colt signs, because it's his direction. He's basically directs the plans, and he signs a contract with Copain. So Copain does it actually directed by Colt and not by the club. So the contract is with Colt. Obviously, it's a triangular thing, but that's why we don't see how much money Colt made out of the building of the golf courses, and there were in total 9. If you go to the publications in the past, but I've identified 9, of which I think 2 have disappeared.
One last question, Robin. I came across this gentleman, Philip Truitt, comes up again. I came across a quote from Philip recently that says, "Tradition is not the worship of ashes, but the preservation of the fire." With that quotation in mind, it struck me that the Kennemer and the Old Nine clubs in the Netherlands seem to connect very authentically and meaningfully with their own fires, their history and heritage, and particularly when it comes to the involvement of Colt and Company. A deep understanding of this history and heritage seems to pervade your committee structures, where learning appears to be amplified through extended tenure and education. Has it always been the case, and how important do you think that history and heritage is to the future of golf, I suppose?
Well, the problem about history is that people always talk about history, but actually know little about it, about history itself. So when this Colt thing came out, and of course there were a few addicts within the Kenema who said, Colt. So when I did my serendipity book, I started actually researching Colt. Before that, it was just a name, and I knew that he was a. And in England, you had a Colt tradition, but you have a Colt Cup anyway. So they decided actually at a certain point of time that the Colt clubs, and actually your question, if there's anything with regards to golf heritage that connects the old nine, as they're called, I don't think so, because they basically just get together and make arrangements to play on each other's courses at a lower green fee. So it's mostly economic reasons. There's nothing there that actually demonstrates to the members of the old nine anything about history of golf in the Netherlands or their history or the connecting. So I would say that if anything, golfing heritage is preserved by the clubs that can be considered cult clubs. And I used to be, but he died, a good friend of mine who basically was in charge of the Cult Cup of the Netherlands. And he made sure that, the people getting together and playing against, so these were the cult clubs. I think there were six or seven. There were a few there who didn't even know that they were cult clubs and who were invited in. Take, for example, Toxandria in Breda. That was designed by John Morrison. But you have to understand the definition of a cult course, a course designed by Harry Colt himself or his company. And his company consisted of, in the beginning, what's his name? Our Scottish friend. The Dr. Mackenzie, sorry. And then Hugh, Alison, and John Morrison, And Toxandria was built by John Morrison, and Amsterdam by Alison, and the Wassenaarse Golf Club in The Hague was also done by Alison. So these clubs have to be quite clear when they describe actually their connection with Colt and what Colt was done, is that they should say that, and that's why I corrected The Hague, because in the history of The Hague, it said that Harry Colt designed and built the golf course of Wassenaar, where they're playing now. And that, of course, that was wrong. It was Hugh Alison who did everything. So you should make it clear in your history books. It's a Colt course, but designed by the Colt company and by Mr. Hugh Alison. So I think that knowledge is now, because Toxandria said, no, we're not a Colt course. Our course was designed by John Morrison. And I said, yeah, but that's Colt. And then the Dommel never realized that they were designed by Colt. And then Eindhoven, of course they did. And then the Amsterdam course, of which only 6 holes are remaining and it's going to disappear. That was done by Charles Alison. And, after opening the course, he said, I think this is the best Colt course in the Netherlands. And it's really the worst. I think it was, it was financial crisis all over the world. So I think they took on that thing. And you can, in the polder land of Amsterdam, in the southeast, and it's underwater most of the time, you could never build a proper golf course. What you had to do there is what they've done nowadays. There are a few golf courses built, like the International and the Dutch, where they actually have the Opens. They bring in huge amounts of sand. I think it cost them €1 million of sand to start off. And that, of course, that should have happened in that course in Amsterdam by Alison, but obviously they didn't have the budget for that or the technical means. And Rotterdam, they also had the new course here, Broek Polder. It's close by. I'm not a member actually, although a lot of my friends are there. But I always I said I cannot become a member of a golf club that doesn't have a golf course.
Dining club with a golfing problem.
Yeah, I would betray my. So they're obviously in writing articles or talking about golf history. The Colt courses are recognized, but there's not really. I think clubs still convene playing for the Colt Cup, but I've noticed that the people who participate actually have no idea what Harry Colt is about. People say, "Yeah, it's a Colt course," and then if you ask that, "Oh yeah, by the way, and who is Harry Colt and what does he mean for golf?" and the most silly stories come up. Yeah. So I'm being a bit negative now, but that's better than saying, it's great that we have these Colt courses in the Netherlands and that you could point out how important it is. There's a friend of mine who's actually a co-member in the European Association of Golf Historians, Christoph Meister. He's actually a very, very good, and probably the only one, good friend of Philip Truitt also. But he's a very good golf writer, good historian. But he knows everything about Colt courses in Germany and in Scandinavia. And by the way, that's not that difficult because there aren't that many. Huh? I've actually agreed with Christoph and with our lady colleague, and she's actually Belgian, French, and has written a book about the history of golf in France, especially this club in the south, which was built by Harry Colt. She knows everything about Colt too. That we would actually write a history book about the Colt golf courses in Europe, and I would take care of the Netherlands, and then she would take care of Belgium and France, maybe Spain. You've got two in Spain, huh? Madrid and Padreña, where he grew up. And then Christoph would take care of Scandinavia and Germany. And that would be actually an interesting golf book, but our lady golfer, she's actually spending her time on another project. And Christoph is actually still employed professionally, so he doesn't have a lot of time left. And I'm not sure how much time and energy I want to put in, but I've still got it. Basically, my information is there, but we can expand, and I can use Arnoud Janmaat on doing a bit more research on finding in the archives more information about Colt and with regards to the clubs in the Netherlands. But we've got most of it, but we can expand on the writing. So that would be a great project, and if we don't do it, maybe we should just do it for the Netherlands. But it's not the question with these things is, you need funding for it because there's really a market. Or you could say, let's keep it digital online. At the end of the day, people do want to have a book in their hands.
Many thanks for tuning in. As usual, you can find us online at firmandfast.golf or on Twitter at firmandfastgolf. Please continue to like, subscribe and comment. It really is appreciated. Until the next time, happy golfing.